The British monarchy did not change because of a sudden death or an open rebellion. It shifted forever in exactly 180 seconds of absolute, terrifying silence behind the high stone walls of Windsor Castle. It is the 1st of July, 2026, and a constitutional earthquake has just rattled the United Kingdom, sending shockwaves across the Atlantic straight to the sun-drenched coast of Montecito, California. What the public believed to be a routine, synchronized transition of duties within the House of Windsor has collapsed into an unprecedented, high-stakes battle for the future of the crown. A secret royal decree, signed under the dark of night by King Charles III, has effectively rewritten the unwritten British Constitution, establishing a legal framework known as joint succession leadership. For the first time in modern history, the sovereign has shared the active mechanism of the royal prerogative before the throne is vacated. This is not an abdication. It is an emergency calibration of power born from a hidden medical crisis that almost brought the British state to its knees, and it has triggered a ruthless institutional counteroffensive against the overseas faction of the family, specifically targeting the highly calculated media strategies of Meghan Markle. To understand the sheer magnitude of what has just occurred, one must look back a few months to an event that the palace managed to bury under a mountain of public relations spin. It was an exclusive, private investiture ceremony held within the grand reception rooms of Windsor Castle. The king had gathered high-ranking military representatives, Commonwealth dignitaries, and senior royals to witness the transfer of several historic royal patronages. Prince William and Catherine, the Princess of Wales, were in attendance, seated in their traditional positions of honor. Nothing in the air suggested disaster. The room was filled with the soft murmur of diplomatic pleasantries, the clinking of ceremonial medals, and the stiff formality that has preserved the monarchy for a millennium. But midway through his official address, King Charles III stopped. The silence did not last for a mere second or two. The king lost his place, his eyes drifting away from the parchment in his hands, his breath catching as a sudden profound disorientation overcame him. For 3 agonizing minutes, the British state stood without an active leader. The senior equerry stepped forward, his hand hovering near his ceremonial sword, paralyzed by protocol. No written protocol existed for this exact scenario. The Prince of Wales did not wait for the court courtiers to debate the legality of the moment. William crossed the room with a swift, decisive stride, placing a firm, stabilizing hand beneath his father's elbow, guiding the disoriented monarch toward a nearby chair. Beside him, Catherine stepped into the vacuum without a shred of hesitation. Addressing the stunned assembly, smooth-talking the foreign dignitaries, and projecting an aura of absolute calm, while the royal physicians were quietly signaled through a side door. Charles recovered his footing within the hour, but the psychological and constitutional damage was already done. That night, behind the closed doors of the king's private study, a bitter but necessary truth was laid bare. William did not mince words with his father. The danger, the prince argued, did not stem from the king's physical vulnerability, but from an antiquated, rigid system that expected the heir to step into a crisis without granting him any explicit, prior legal authority to do so. In the modern age of digital warfare, global volatility, and intense press scrutiny, a 3-minute vacuum of power could destroy a nation's stability. The king listened in total silence, staring at the empty desk before him. Before the sun rose, Charles demanded a comprehensive review of every piece of legislation regarding regency, succession, and the constitutional authority of the Prince of Wales. The result of that turbulent night is the explosive document that has just been finalized this week. The Royal Succession and Crown Maintenance Act does something the British public never anticipated. It officially elevates Prince William and Catherine to the status of active constitutional partners. It gives them immediate, unrestricted access to the sovereign's weekly red boxes, the highly confidential government briefings containing intelligence reports and state secrets that have traditionally been seen by the reigning monarch alone. It forces the bureaucratic machinery of Whitehall and Buckingham Palace to route long-term state ceremonies, Commonwealth tours, and emergency national security planning through Kensington Palace. Effectively, a single stroke of the king's pen has stripped away the final, protective buffer zone between William's young family and the overwhelming weight of the throne. But this sudden consolidation of power has not been met with universal celebration within the family. The immediate domestic casualty of this decree was the domestic standing of Queen Camilla. For years, Camilla has been the quiet anchor beside Charles, navigating the turbulent waters of public opinion and stabilizing the king's emotional landscape during his ongoing health battles. When Charles summoned William, Catherine, and Camilla to a private drawing room to present the final draft of the decree, the atmosphere turned ice cold. No secretaries were present to soften the language. No advisors were there to shield them from the raw reality of the text. When Camilla read the specific clauses outlining the joint succession leadership, she immediately recognized the unspoken implication. The center of gravity within the palace was shifting permanently toward the younger generation. Her own sphere of influence, her status as the primary confidant to the reigning king, was being legally diluted. When she asked with cold precision whether this act diminished the institutional role of the current queen consort, Catherine answered instead of Charles. The Princess of Wales stated calmly that the law was not designed to replace anyone, but to prevent chaos when the country required immediate, undeniable leadership. Camilla's sharp retort that institutions always use the word continuity when they actually mean displacement shattered any illusion of domestic harmony. The queen consort left the room, closing the heavy oak door with a force that resonated louder than any legal argument. By the following morning, the legendary red box that had occupied a permanent spot on her private office desk for years had been redirected to the workspace of the Princess of Wales. Yet, as intense as the internal palace friction has been, it pales in comparison to the geopolitical chess match currently being played out between London and California. The timing of King Charles's decree is not an accident. For the past several months, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry have been orchestrating a massive, multi-million-dollar media campaign designed to launch a competing royal narrative from their estate in Montecito. With their Netflix contracts facing renewal pressures and their Archewell brand suffering a string of commercial setbacks frequently mocked by the American press, as the Montecito meltdown, the Sussexes knew they needed a massive public relations victory to restore their global standing. Their weapon of choice was the upcoming countdown events for the 2027 Invictus Games, scheduled to take place in Birmingham, England. Sensing a golden opportunity to stage a triumphant return to British soil, Meghan Markle had meticulously planned a high-profile, multi-day faux royal tour of the UK set for early July 2026. The strategy was brilliant in its audacity. Meghan intended to fly into London with Prince Harry and, crucially, their two children, Archie and Lilibet. It would be the first time the children had returned to the UK in years. The American media was already being briefed on a series of carefully managed public appearances, charity galas, and photographic opportunities that would project an image of a progressive, empathetic alternative to the traditional, stiff hierarchy of the British court. Meghan's ultimate goal was to capture a highly publicized, tearful moment of family reconciliation between the king and his estranged grandchildren, a visual asset that would instantly supercharge the Sussex brand and provide endless content for their upcoming media projects. But King Charles III, now flanked by a legally empowered and strategically ruthless William and Catherine, anticipated the move. The king did not issue an emotional statement or engage in a public war of words. Instead, he used the absolute authority of the state to dismantle Meghan's plan from the inside out. In the final days of June 2026, acting with the quiet backing of the Executive Committee for the Protection of Royalty and VIPs, known as RAVIC, the king effectively pulled the rug out from under the Sussexes' feet. The palace delivered a confidential, legally binding notice to the Sussex legal team. The decree was absolute. Because Harry and Meghan had voluntarily stepped back as working members of the royal family, they were officially categorized as private citizens when operating outside the parameters of official state events. Therefore, the British government would completely deny their request for taxpayer-funded, armed police protection during their stay in the UK. Meghan's team scrambled, offering to pay for the security privately, but the state's answer remained an unyielding no. Under British law, private individuals cannot hire armed police officers or utilize state intelligence networks to clear public venues. To make the counterstroke even more devastating, Charles combined this security denial with a masterclass in royal diplomacy. He offered the Sussexes an official suite of rooms inside the heavily fortified walls of St. James's Palace for the duration of their visit, noting that they would be completely safe within the royal shadow. It was an exquisite, inescapable trap. If Meghan accepted the offer, she would be entirely under the physical control and surveillance of the palace apparatus, unable to bring private camera crews, stage unapproved media events, or control her own narrative. If she refused the offer and complained about security, she would look petulant, ungrateful, and terrified to the British public. The effect of this legal and tactical ambush was instantaneous. As June turned into July, panic gripped the Sussex camp in California. Prince Harry was reported by close sources to be deeply distressed, caught between his desire to support the Invictus Games in his homeland and the absolute collapse of the security apparatus required to protect his family in public. Meghan's meticulously designed PR campaign, which relied heavily on the public spectacle of her children walking through London, was shattered at the 11th hour. The realization has set in that the British monarchy is no longer playing defense. King Charles's new decree has not just reorganized the internal hierarchy of London. It has created a hardened, highly coordinated operational unit at Kensington Palace that views the California branch not as estranged family members to be coddled, but as an active threat to the stability of the throne that must be neutralized with legal precision. As the first week of July begins, the stage is set for a confrontation that will determine who truly controls the narrative of the modern British crown. The fallout from the king's secret decree rippled through the corridors of British power with astonishing velocity, leaving no doubt that the old ways of royal governance were dead. At Kensington Palace, the atmosphere was one of intense, disciplined focus. Prince William and Catherine, the Princess of Wales, did not celebrate their sudden elevation to constitutional partners. Instead, they immediately absorbed the overwhelming administrative realities of the Royal Succession and Crown Maintenance Act. The Princess of Wales, whose strategic mind had often been underestimated by her critics, found herself at the very center of the new royal apparatus. Her desk was no longer covered merely with the patronages of charities and cultural institutions. It was now piled high with the sensitive diplomatic briefings of the Commonwealth and the structural blueprints of the future court. The transition was swift and uncompromising. Every major administrative decision, every long-term state engagement, and every security assessment now required the joint signature of the Prince and Princess of Wales before it could even be presented to the king. This was the practical execution of joint succession leadership, and its first major objective was the total neutralization of the media campaign originating from California. Across the Atlantic, inside the private offices of the Montecito estate, the reaction to London's swift legal maneuver was one of sheer disbelief and growing fury. Meghan Markle had spent the better part of the spring orchestrating what she believed would be an unassailable public relations triumph. The countdown to the Birmingham Games was supposed to be her grand re-entry into the British consciousness, a carefully choreographed display of modern, compassionate star power that would expose the traditional monarchy as archaic and out of touch. She had already lined up high-profile interviews with American networks, secured exclusive filming rights for her production crews, and planned the exact moments her children, Archie and Lilibet, would be introduced to the global press on British soil. The sudden, absolute denial of state-funded armed security by the Ravik Committee completely shattered the foundation of this multi-million-dollar strategy. Without police protection, the logistics of moving through public spaces in London became a security nightmare, rendering the planned public galas and walkabouts impossible to execute. The true brilliance of the king's counterstroke lay in its flawless legal trapping. By offering the Sussexes a secure residence within the walls of St. James's Palace, Charles had effectively stripped Meghan of her primary weapon, the narrative of victimhood. She could no longer claim to the international press that her family was being cast out into the cold or left unprotected by a cruel institution. The state had offered absolute protection, but only within the confines of the sovereign's physical control. To accept the offer meant surrendering all logistical autonomy to the very courtiers she had spent years denouncing. To refuse the offer meant canceling the trip entirely, a move that would deal a devastating blow to the Archewell brand and signal a total defeat in her ongoing war of influence with the British crown. As the realization of this strategic checkmate settled over Montecito, Prince Harry found himself increasingly isolated, torn between his remaining duties to his homeland and the rigid, high-stakes demands of his wife's American media empire. The palace had not just drawn a line in the sand, they had erected an impenetrable constitutional fortress, and for the first time since leaving her royal duties, Meghan Markle found herself completely powerless against the calculated precision of the British state. The tension within the royal family reached a boiling point when King Charles summoned Prince William and Catherine to Buckingham Palace for an unscripted confrontation. The meeting was completely devoid of courtiers, private secretaries, or diplomatic advisors. For the first time since the signing of the Royal Succession and Crown Maintenance Act, the father and son stood face to face as monarchs in all but name, stripped of the grand titles that had dictated their interactions for their entire lives. The king sat behind his heavy desk, pouring 2 glasses of water himself rather than signaling for a footman. The physical toll of his recent health battles was visible in the deep lines of his face, yet his eyes retained a fierce, uncompromising clarity. He looked at his son and explained that this new legislation did not arise from a lack of faith in William's ability to govern, but from a profound terror that the British state had become dangerously dependent on the fragile health of a single individual. Charles confessed that signing the decree felt exactly like writing the very first sentence of his own departure from the world. Prince William looked at his father with a painful, unvarnished honesty, responding that he did not want the crown if accepting its power made his father feel erased from the history of his own reign. The king shook his head, explaining that every true sovereign must eventually choose between protecting their current position or protecting what comes after them. This was not a surrender. It was an act of supreme institutional sacrifice. Charles then demanded a solemn promise from the future king. Catherine must never be treated as a mere ceremonial figure or isolated by the complex political maneuvers of the court. The king had insisted that her name appear explicitly throughout every single clause of the succession framework because her emotional resilience and connection to the public would prevent the future court from becoming cold, distant, and imprisoned by its own authority. William gave his word, realizing that his father was trying to heal the structural failures of past generations, ensuring that no royal spouse would ever again have to carry the crushing weight of the monarchy without protection, a voice, or recognize constitutional power. As this private agreement solidified the bond between the king and the Prince of Wales, a parallel transformation was altering the life of the Princess of Wales. Catherine sat in her study at Kensington Palace, reading a highly confidential family file that outlined the gradual integration of her eldest son, Prince George, into formal constitutional training. The crown was already shaping the future of her 12-year-old child years before he could fully comprehend the immense sacrifices it would demand of him. The new law had permanently altered their family life, narrowing the personal freedoms of her children and dragging every private choice closer to the unrelenting glare of public duty. Yet, Catherine accepted this heavy burden without hesitation. While Meghan Markle struggled to maintain her global standing from California, Catherine emerged as the absolute emotional anchor of the British nation. Her recent public appearances had sent a powerful message to the world. The future queen was not waiting for the throne to come to her. She was already actively shaping the destiny of the British monarchy through unity, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to the sovereign state. The psychological warfare between London and Montecito escalated to an unprecedented intensity during the final 48 hours of June in the year 2026. Inside the secure perimeter of Buckingham Palace, the implementation of the new royal decree proceeded with corporate coldness. The administrative machinery began dismantling the traditional privileges of those who chose to operate outside the institutional collective. The king's inner circle of legal experts, acting under the direct supervision of Prince William, initiated a thorough audit of all auxiliary royal properties and secondary allowances. The most immediate and striking casualty of this systemic tightening was the total erasure of Prince Harry's remaining military associations from official palace communications. The message from the British establishment was clear and unyielding. The crown would no longer permit its historic titles to be used as marketing tools for commercial ventures in North America. Every avenue of passive influence that the Sussexes had relied upon to maintain their royal status was being systematically closed by the very institution they had sought to reinvent from afar. The domestic reaction in California to this relentless institutional pressure was a volatile mixture of panic and deep-seated resentment. Meghan Markle watched her elaborate public relations strategy disintegrate into a series of frantic legal appeals and media compromises. The realization that the British state would not back down on the issue of armed security forced her team into a desperate damage control mode. Representatives from their production company held emergency meetings with network executives to discuss the potential fallout of a canceled or significantly altered United Kingdom tour. The commercial reality was brutal. The American television networks were interested in the Sussexes primarily for their access to the grand pageantry and internal access of the British monarchy. Without the majestic backdrop of London, without the dramatic imagery of royal reconciliation, and without the presence of the young prince and princess on British soil, the commercial value of the Sussex brand suffered a catastrophic decline. The narrative of progressive exile was losing its power to captivate an increasingly indifferent global audience. In a desperate bid to salvage the situation, Prince Harry attempted to bypass the official palace channels, launching a series of direct personal phone calls to his father's private line at Sandringham. However, the new constitutional reality of joint succession leadership meant that even the king's personal communications were subject to the new security and administrative protocols established by Prince William and Catherine. The calls were redirected to the office of the king's private secretary, who informed the Duke of Sussex that any discussion regarding security, logistics, or residential arrangements must be submitted in writing to the Joint Committee at Kensington Palace. This bureaucratic redirection was the ultimate humiliation for the prince, confirming that his elder brother now held the legal keys to his father's kingdom. The emotional distance between the two brothers had finally transformed into a permanent legal barrier, leaving the California branch completely isolated as the international media began reporting on the sudden and mysterious collapse of the Grand July homecoming. The dawn of July in the year 2026 brought a public display of royal authority that forever solidified the new constitutional reality in the eyes of the British public. While the international press was still digesting the rumors of the sudden and chaotic cancellation of the Sussex homecoming, Kung Dearn Kensington executed a media masterstroke that effectively ended the war of narratives. The Princess of Wales, having recently announced the successful completion of her preventative medical treatments, made an unannounced appearance that captured the imagination of the entire country. In a powerful demonstration of physical resilience and mental fortitude, Catherine led a small, dedicated team to complete the grueling National Three Peaks Challenge, scaling the highest mountains in Scotland, England, and Wales within a single 24-hour period to raise awareness for young cancer patients. The image of the future queen, standing atop the windswept peak of Ben Nevis, exhausted but triumphant, became an instant cultural phenomenon. It was the ultimate, unanswerable response to the highly staged, commercialized public relations campaigns originating from California. Catherine did not need a Hollywood production crew or a carefully scripted interview to command the respect of the world. Her power came from genuine service, quiet endurance, and an absolute commitment to her national duties. This display of authentic royal leadership cast an unforgiving shadow over the frantic damage control occurring within the Montecito estate. The contrast between the two women could not have been more striking or more damaging to the Sussex brand. While Catherine was braving the elements on the mountains of Great Britain, Meghan Markle was forced to release a strained, bureaucratic statement through her public relations representatives, attributing the postponement of their highly anticipated July tour to unspecified security concerns and logistical complications. The British public received the news with an overwhelming sense of indifference, mixed with a quiet satisfaction that the Crown had refused to compromise on its core principles. The mainstream media openly mocked the statement, pointing out that the king had offered a secure, fortified residence inside St. James's Palace, which the Sussexes had rejected simply because it did not allow them to film their private commercial projects. The narrative of the persecuted exiles had completely lost its currency. It was now widely understood that Meghan and Harry were not victims of a cruel institution, but private individuals who had simply been outmaneuvered by a more disciplined, legally empowered adversary. Within the silent walls of Buckingham Palace, King Charles watched the public reaction with a profound sense of relief. The Royal Succession and Crown Maintenance Act had achieved exactly what he had intended. It had protected the monarchy from external manipulation, while seamlessly transitioning the operational weight of the sovereign authority to his heir. The king spent the afternoon in his private study with Prince William, reviewing the initial public opinion polls, which showed an overwhelming 80% approval rating for the new joint succession leadership framework. The British people did not view the shared authority as a sign of royal weakness, but as a brilliant, forward-thinking measure that ensured absolute political and constitutional stability for the United Kingdom. As the two men prepared for an upcoming state dinner, the king took a historic family document from his desk, a private letter written by Queen Victoria regarding the nature of royal duty, and handed it to his son. It was a silent acknowledgement that the torch had been successfully passed. The institution had survived the modern storm, and as the evening sun set over London, the absolute dominance of the Kensington ascendancy was beyond any legal or public question. The final act of this historic transformation unfolded before the eyes of thousands gathered outside the gates of Buckingham Palace on a bright July afternoon in the year 2026. The British public had not come to mourn the twilight of a reign, nor had they come to celebrate a premature succession. They were there to witness a phenomenon entirely unique in the thousand-year history of the British monarchy, a reigning sovereign standing in absolute unity with his designated protectors of the future. When the grand balcony doors swung open, King Charles III stepped out into the sunlight. He wore his full ceremonial uniform, his chest adorned with the medals of a lifetime of service. But he did not stand alone. To his right stood Prince William, and to his left stood Catherine, the Princess of Wales. The roar from the crowd was deafening, a wave of public affirmation that validated every difficult secret decision made behind closed doors over the past several months. This was the visual manifestation of joint succession leadership. The king had not abdicated his throne, nor had his authority been diminished. Instead, by formalizing the transition through the Royal Succession and Crown Maintenance Act, he had elevated his family and secured his nation against the unpredictable storms of the modern age. Just moments before stepping onto the historic balcony, a quiet event occurred in the private anteroom that defined the true emotional spirit of the day. King Charles turned to his son, reaching out with a steady hand to adjust the heavy ceremonial shoulder cords on Prince William's uniform. It was a traditional gesture of military and paternal correction, but in that quiet room, it carried the immense weight of a peaceful transfer of power. The king looked into his son's eyes and gave a gentle, approving nod. No words were spoken, and none were needed. The Prince of Wales did not look triumphant. He looked entirely prepared, carrying the heavy burden of his new constitutional duties with a calm, stoic discipline. Nearby, Catherine adjusted her own posture, her expression serene but filled with an undeniable strength. The king had given her actual, recognized authority within the state framework, because he knew that her steady judgment would protect the crown from becoming a cold, unyielding monolith. The hierarchy of past generations, which had so often isolated and destroyed the spouses of the heirs, had been permanently replaced by a resilient, legally protected partnership. Even the domestic wounds that had threatened to fracture the palace from within were quietly resolved in this final moment of public solidarity. Queen Camilla stepped onto the balcony alongside the triumphant trio, her expression one of dignified composure. She had fought fiercely to protect her own standing and the traditional boundaries of her husband's reign, but she ultimately chose institutional survival over domestic division. Her presence beside Charles signaled to the world that the inner circle of the monarchy remained unbreakable, leaving no room for the external forces of disruption to exploit any perceived vulnerability. This unified front delivered the final, conclusive blow to the narrative of conflict that the California faction had attempted to sustain for so many years. Meghan Markle's ambitious plans to stage a competing royal court from Montecito had been completely erased by the grand, authentic reality displaying itself in London. The Sussexes were left to contemplate their growing isolation from their distant estate, while the true center of royal influence solidified itself around the disciplined figures standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. As the cheers of the crowd echoed across London, the long-term significance of King Charles's bold reform became undeniable. The king had proven that the true strength of a monarch is measured not by how tightly they cling to absolute power during their final years, but by how wisely they prepare the state for the day they are no longer there to lead it. The old dependence on blind tradition and vague hope had been replaced by a sharp, modern legal framework that ensured absolute continuity for the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms. Prince William was now a fully empowered constitutional partner. Catherine was the legally recognized anchor of the future reign, and young Prince George was beginning his structured journey toward his eventual destiny. The British monarchy had faced the modern era of media warfare and internal crisis, and through a masterclass in strategic statecraft, it had emerged stronger, more unified, and entirely prepared for the future. The new dawn of the House of Windsor had officially begun.